Well, good morning, fam. It is another episode of Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. Today, my guest is Mike McShane, Director of National Research with the education nonprofit EdChoice. Mike, welcome. Thank you for being on this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Make it like C-SPAN here. Well, listen, I I've been waiting to have you on for a while. I wanted to, I always want to have you on, first of all. Let's just say that. You do such good research around what families are choosing and your organization, the organization that you're with, EdChoice, everybody who's listening or watching should go and check them out. EdChoice is one of the best organizations, not one of the best. It clearly is the leader in being able to display information in a way that normal people, mere mortals, can understand. So if you have any questions, thoughts, or ideas about what types of school choice there are in the United States, and you need a concise way to understand it. You need a way in which you don't have to be some crazy policy wonk to understand it. EdChoice is your gig, so you can find them at edchoice.org. You can also find Mike there. His email is mcshane@edchoice.org. I want to get this all out at the beginning in case anybody has any questions that they want to get to you or they want to find you. So the reason that Mike is here today, though, is besides me just always wanting to engage with Mike, is that you have a new book out. So this is what book for you, by the way? How many books do you have total?
Well, it depends. So if you count the ones I've edited and everything, I think this is 11.
Yeah, you're an underachiever, Mike. Mike, you really gotta you gotta really pick up the pace a little bit. By your age, you should have at least more books than that. I don't know, 11 books.
What can I do?
And some of them you've written with just great people. Like you just have great people in your orbit. I have one back out there that I just used for a paper that I wrote not long ago. And I thought I had never heard of this book or whatnot. I came up in a regular search, not like a I know Mike search. It came up in, one of my Google stuff. And I'm like, I know the author of this book. This is amazing. So your new book, hold it up again so that people can see it. So this is Mike's new book on hybrid schooling. And what I find, first of all, at the very top, what I find very interesting, Mike, is that you started writing this book before the pandemic. So this isn't like a, pandemic-esque book. That's not where it came from. What started you on the path to writing the story before the pandemic even was here? Why were you interested in the topic of hybrid homeschooling?
Yeah, so I've been interested for years in school choice, in educational innovation, in educational entrepreneurship. And I've hosted this podcast for EdChoice for years called Cool Schools, where I have this very fun job of interviewing interesting and innovative school leaders. So I hear through the grapevine that someone somewhere is doing cool and doing cool stuff. And I get them on the horn and say, hey, can we talk about what your school's doing, what lessons you've learned, and maybe what you can teach other people that are trying to do this stuff. And I found out through, I started my career as a high school teacher. I did this teaching program called ACE, the Alliance for Catholic Education. It's kind of like Catholic Teach for America. That's like the easy one. We're proud of it because we think it's more rigorous. I got like a master's degree and did more coursework and stuff, but conceptually, that's probably the easiest thing to understand. And then, so through that, I have this big web of teachers and people that I know that I was classmates with and friends with. And I knew one of them taught in a hybrid homeschool, and one sent their kids to a hybrid homeschool. And I just saw like on social media that they were talking about it. I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I interviewed this woman, Carrie Beckman, who runs this group of schools out of Atlanta, but they've spread all over the country, called the Regina Chaley schools, that are hybrid homeschool. So kids go to school 2 or 3 days a week, and they're schooled at home for 2 or 3 days a week. And so I had her on the podcast, and I was completely ignorant about this. This was back in like 2018. So I had her on the podcast, and I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. And this is what you're doing, whatever. And I also write a column for Forbes, and I'm always kind of hurting for content. So I was like, look, I'll just write up a quick thing. Here's what we talked about in this podcast. I'm kind of a policy guy. So this is how it intersects with policy. Maybe we'll have to think about sort of how we define a school in the future and all of that. Hit post. And for me, like, if I write something that like a couple thousand people view on Forbes, like, I had a great day. Like, that's awesome. Cool. Love it. So I post that not thinking people would really care that much about it. Thought it was kind of a niche topic, and then just went on like living my life. And when I looked back on it, the page views just went crazy. And before I knew it, it had been viewed more than 100,000 times. And the emails started pouring in. All of these folks somehow tracked me down and were saying, these were teachers, these were families saying, this looks amazing, I would love to try it. And what struck me was the kind of diversity of people that were emailing me. Urban, rural, religious, non-religious, the whole kind of kaleidoscope of races and ethnicities and all of these things that I'm just like, well, maybe I'm onto something here. Like maybe something's happening here that I was just completely unaware of. And so that started me down the path. I tracked down more of these folks. And as I met with more people and talked with more folks and realized, wait, this is something that's happening in the traditional public schooling sector. It's happening in the public charter sector. It's happening in the private sector. And in an education world that can be so divisive right now, where it's sort of adversarial, things are set against one another, I'm like, wow, this is something that actually cuts across a lot of these different groups. And as I talked with families and others, people were coming at it for different reasons. There wasn't like one set of things that people were kind of going for. And so I thought this was this interesting topic. So I basically took last school year to write the book. And so I started interviewing, talking to people, and then the pandemic hits. And so what became like this rather niche thing that maybe a few hundred or a few thousand schools do across the country, suddenly like tens of millions of families are doing. And so it's been wild. So I tried to, as much, I kind of wrote most of the book last year, went to the publisher over the kind of summer, late summer. And so I tried to spend as much time as I could last summer writing about, meeting with people, talking with people, saying, look, all of you are going to try and do this kind of on the fly. Here's what some of these schools have been doing for a long time and some lessons that they've learned that maybe you can apply. And so, yeah, and then it's just been wild because now it seems like mostly schools are going back to a sort of in-person, but there's still a bit of hybrid stuff going on. And so the question is sort of like, so what's going to happen now? Like, is this going to be part of the education system in the future? Was it something that a lot of people tried and they aren't going to want to do it anymore? So it was a heck of a time to write a book about hybrid homeschooling. I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
I can.
Yeah, no worries. just to start with the definition so that we're clear on this. Hybrid homeschooling, you mentioned there are people who do hybrid homeschooling where a few days a week they're in a school of some sort. I don't know what kind, but some sort. And then they do a portion of their education at home. Is that the straight up simple version of what it is, or is there more to it?
Yeah, the simple definition I have is just a schooling sort of modality where kids are at home for part of the week and they're at school for part of the week. Mm-hmm. To dive like slightly deeper into it, generally speaking, when we do research on homeschooling, there isn't actually like a clear-cut shared definition of what makes someone a homeschooler. So like the federal government, when they collect statistics, sort of have different views in some advocacy organizations and others. But generally speaking, researchers have kind of agreed that there are three things that make you a homeschooler. It is funding, control, and location, right? So it's funded by your parents, it's controlled by your parents, and it's located in your home. And then if we think about sort of like traditional public schooling, it's kind of the opposite of all of that, right? It's not funded by your parents, it's not controlled by your parents, and it's not controlled in your home. So what hybrid schooling is like the midpoint between that. So it's partially controlled by your parents, it's partially located in your home, and then depending on how it works, it's kind of partially funded by your parents, depending on sort of how that goes. So that's the way to sort of define it. I had to also, because there's so much fuzziness, and especially like the coronavirus has done this too, where we have micro schools and pandemic pods and homeschool co-ops, like a lot of the stuff that already existed before. And I had to try and like put some edges around it just so that my book wasn't about everything, that it was just about one thing. Knowing that as soon as I drew that definition, there would be people right on the edges who were like, well, what about this? Or what about that? But the big definition that I used was sort of three parts: physical, substantial, and regular. So what I mean by that is a student has to go to a physical location and like the same physical location for a substantial period of time, which I define as at least 1 day a week regularly. So basically, you go to a place that we would sort of recognize as a school. Like you go to the school for at least 1 day per week. That's to qualify in the types of schools that I study. So some of them go 4 days a week, some of them go 3, some go 2, some go 1, some go for like half days every day. So there's all these different permutations of it. But to at least get into what I was talking about here, you had to go to like a regular school for at least 1 day per week.
Here in Minnesota, there is this just by state law. If you're a homeschooler, you have access to the regular educational services, like activities, and I even think electives through the school. Sure. By law, you can access them. And then we also have a hodgepodge of other little credits. Like, you can, you can take credit for tutoring services, any materials, things like that. But we're not very much a homeschooling state. We're not, but we have these. So if you're savvy enough, you can cobble together these things. Did you find that there was a big difference in what people are able to do based upon their state and their state laws?
Yeah, absolutely. So part-time enrollment laws have been around for a long time. Places like Iowa, Alaska have allowed homeschoolers to take some classes a la carte. Like this is not uncommon. Kansas, so it sounds like Minnesota as well. That's not uncommon. And you're right. In some cases, it's like you can only take electives, and some you can only take so many classes. But public policy is really what drives this, right? So can public schools get part-time enrollment dollars, right? So can they, for a kid that takes 1 credit, do they get the funding for that 1 credit, or are they sort of just having to absorb it with everything else? When it comes to creating some of these programs, and so I talk a little bit in the book about part-time enrollment. Generally speaking, the types of public school programs that I'm talking about are like dedicated, purposeful hybrid homeschooling program. So there's one I talk about in Fleming County, Kentucky, which is like a rural county that's there. It's called the Fleming County Performance Academy. And so in addition to their kind of traditional schooling, they've created this separate program for homeschoolers. And so some of the homeschoolers do like a full-time remote thing. And again, this was before the pandemic, or they take kind of remote classes a la carte. And then some they take dedicated in-person class, but it's like a specific program designed for them. These are very popular in Michigan as well. There are some in California. But public policy plays a big role in this. Like the Kentucky program only is able to exist because they have a competency-based framework for determining student progress, right? So if your state bases stuff off seat time, right? Like what determines that you passed 4th grade was you spent X number of hours in a classroom in a seat. You can't do hybrid homeschooling, right? Because you're not in that seat the whole time. So you have to have that kind of competency-based framework that's there. And then the other piece is the funding, right? So one example of a state that's been, has been doing this for a very long time is Colorado. And Colorado has a part-time enrollment law that says for students who attend, I think it's if you go for more than 90 but fewer than 360 hours, which is like about half of a school week, you can get half of the funding for that student. So not surprisingly, lots of charter schools, traditional public school districts have created these hybrid homeschool programs because for the kids that they enroll, they can get, as long as they don't cross that kind of half-time threshold, they get half the funding for them. So I think if that sort of thing didn't exist, schools would be less likely to want to do something like this. So creating more flexible funding, and then obviously like there's the whole side of this of like private school choice programs could facilitate this in the private school space. I'm talking mostly in the public school space. And the last like public policy thing that matters too is charter authorizing, right? I think, and I've been a kind of gentle but not so gentle critic of charter authorizing over the years, in the sense that sometimes I think they've privileged incumbents too much. That it's sort of like if you have a model that has worked somewhere else, they like roll out the red carpet for you. But if you're more independent, right? If you're more independent, or if you want to do something a little bit different, the level of scrutiny is much higher. And so part of what I talk about in the book is like charter authorizers in the places where there's space for this have got to be more flexible and have got to say like, look, I get it. Like you love KIPP and you love these schools, and I do too. I would be very clear. Like they're great, But like, you can't say, if that's like your model of what a charter school is, all of these new innovative models are not going to be able to crop up. So our friends in charter authorizing also have to look at some of these things that are happening in other places and kind of expand their minds a little bit and say, this is stuff that people are interested in. It does work in other places, and we should try it.
You know, what's so funny about that is the national charter school movement, or the national charter school leaders, they really hate Minnesota. And, you know, I just like to remind, and I like to remind everybody that we're the birthplace of charters. So you can eat
That's
it.
what I was
You can
thinking.
just eat it, you know.
Why don't they like Minnesota?
They hate Minnesota because they think our charter authorizing laws are too loose. They think that, you know, we're very much a thousand flowers bloom market. We're not a chain market. We don't have a lot of CMOs. We don't have one CMO that I can think of, really. We don't have like the big box, you know, the Best Buy Circuit City charter schools. We have like mom and pop charter schools that come out of the communities that they're from, you know, Somali communities have them, you know, but boy, do they hate it. Like, I bring it up. I didn't know this until I started doing national work, and I'd bump into people and I'd be talking about it, and they'd be like, yeah, we know Minnesota. Like, you know, we're not doing enough of the KIPS for them. We have one KIPS school, and it sits by itself on a little island, like that polar bear in Inconvenient Truth. It's just like floating off to sea,
slowly floating away. You know, it's funny because Kansas City is similar, right? So we have a very decentralized, like a lot of one-off charter schools and whatever. But I know we're sort of veering from hybrid homeschooling, but I think this is important, right? One of the things that I noticed as someone who's kind of involved in sort of civic things in Kansas City and others, you know, when I'm in a meeting or some sort of public thing, and someone gets up and says something like ignorant about charter schools, inevitably, if the room is large enough, there is someone else in that room that's like involved in charter schooling that, like, wait a second, like, I'm on the board of a charter school, or like my mother teaches in a charter school. Like, I send my kids to schools. Like, what are you talking about? And when those things have been built from the ground up and like local people build them, like, that sort of stuff doesn't fly as easily. But when it's a lot of sort of outside people or these big chains, it's so much easier to either stereotype them or say incorrect things, or people just can't like read the landscape of what's going on, like, or not know, they don't necessarily know the history of what's happened in the past in cities. And they just like walk with it, like walking into the rake. It's like, you know, they keep walking into the same rake of like, do you not remember what happened 10 years ago? Oh, no, wait, you don't remember what happened 10 years ago because you're not from here. Like, you don't know what's happening. Whereas these community-driven schools actually like reflect what the community wants. It's crazy. It's crazy when you actually have folks, like local folks, build schools locally, and people actually like them. I don't know. We're digressing, but I agree with you. I agree with you 100% on that.
Well, and I will say this is why I'm interested in your topic, is just that because we have that type of charter market, and we've also been, I don't know if you know this about Minneapolis, but Minneapolis years ago was one of two places in the country that got like a school choice demonstration grant from the federal government in the 1970s to try out, like, so a whole section of the district was just kind of, they created a zone and they just said, do whatever you want. Like take all your schools and just like take them all offline and it became what's called the Southeast Demonstration Project, federal government. The other school choice demonstration site was Alum Rock, California.
And in Alum Rock, that one. I didn't know about the Minneapolis one.
Yeah, the one in Alum Rock actually ended up being like the Empire Strikes Back, the status quo kind of, you know, took it over. The one in Minneapolis went the other direction. They created all kinds of weird, crazy schools. Just became like a big thing. Oh yeah, few of which still exist. They built a school inside the university. They built free schools, open schools. They built a K-12 free school where there was, you know, the curriculum wasn't set. Like it was just kind of, they had all these hippie type schools, all kinds of stuff going on. And in that environment is, you know, that charter schools come out of that environment, like that ability to think that anything's possible. Hybrid homeschooling might be the next way that people start thinking. In a market like ours, it's sellable. Now I want to ask you about this. In your book, you say hybrid homeschooling is not for everybody. And then you do give like 4 personas or 4 people that you think that it could be for. You say the underestimated child of color, the urban Christian, the kid who needs a break from school. And oh God, that was me. I actually fit in several of these categories, just so you know. And then the last one is the middle income pedagogue. So for the first three of those, I may have been a perfect candidate as a young person for this, but thinking about those four personas, and I'll say them again for people listening and watching who this might be for: the underestimated child of color, the urban Christian, the kid who needs a break, and the middle income pedagogue. Let's start with the underestimated child of color. In your book, you say you talk about three researchers that analyzed data from the National Longitudinal Survey of 2002. They found that white teachers, who account for 79% of all U.S. public school teachers, have far lower expectations for Black students than they do for similarly situated white students. 79%. I know this research, but that number just like sticks in my head and breaks out. So why might hybrid homeschooling be an option for the underestimated child of color?
So I think for two reasons. One, I think it's just the general sort of critique of education that's based in what you were talking about there, that has been a motivation for Black homeschooling for years. And this is, I think, an unfortunately understudied area. I hope some new data came out earlier this week that I hope is going to open people's eyes to the history of and the prevalence of homeschooling in the Black community. So the data that came out earlier this week, the Census Bureau has been doing this pulse survey since the beginning of the coronavirus, where they've been trying to kind of rapid cycle understand how the coronavirus has been impacting families. And they asked this question about homeschooling. They said, what percentage of families are homeschooling? And they were clear, not talking about remote learning from home, but actually like removing your kids from the schools and teaching them at home. And the headline was, back in April, sort of when the coronavirus started, about 5% of households were homeschooling. And by October, it was 11%. So more than double in that time period. But one of the things that was next, they broke it down by race, and they found that African-American families, while 3% were homeschooling at the beginning, 16% were homeschooling by October, right? So that is an incredible amount of growth and represents a huge portion of families, right? 16% is a huge number. And they were, of all of the demographic groups, they were the most likely to homeschool. And so again, this is a longer trend of much of the history of African-American homeschooling has come from families who believe that either their child, the expectations are not high enough, that people are underestimating their child, and two, I think around a lot of discipline stuff, especially young boys, that were more likely to get suspended or just to be seen as a discipline problem, just as young boys being young boys rather than being viewed as young boys are viewed as discipline problems, right? I think this is something that research literature has sort of showed for a long time. And so what hybrid homeschooling does is, on the one hand, just like has those kids at home, right? So where their parents aren't going to underestimate them like teachers or like other educators might. But also, one of the big themes that I talk about in this book is the communities that are built around these schools, because they only function if teachers and parents have a really close relationship with one another. So, right, like if one of you is handling it for 2 days and one of you is handling it for 3 days, if y'all aren't on the same page, this is not going to work, right? Like, you have to work together. And so I tend to think that by forging those relationships with one another and really getting to know families and getting to know teachers, it is much more likely that those students will be respected, believed in, understood. So it's both of those things, like just having kids at home more where their parents can reinforce behavior, values, all of that great stuff. But then also by being in this much more closely connected school environment where they are better understood, and all of that good sort of positive stuff that we get from strong communities can happen.
It's interesting, for a while now, and if people do just a basic Google search, for a while now, Black families have been the fastest growing segment of homeschooling. The relation or the reasons that are given oftentimes are different than the reasons other people give. Generally, for a long period of time, homeschooling was considered to be a conservative Christian thing that white families with resources were doing. The emerging group of Black families that became the fastest growing group of homeschoolers, the number one reason was to really take control of what their children were learning and to eradicate, to keep them out of harm's way of racism. So it was really the ultimate taking charge as a parent. It's the ultimate, it's agency. It's agency times 10. Like,
Yeah.
I can do something about, the way that my child grows up. So a second group that you were talking about, go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt, but it's funny just because I'm literally, as you were talking, I saw this on my desk. I'm in the middle of, I don't know if you've read The Omni Americans, Albert Murray's great book. Chris, The Omni Americans.
Huh? Okay.
Yeah, The Omni Americans, Some Alternatives to the Folklore of White Supremacy. So Albert Murray wrote this. This is the 50th anniversary edition. So I think he wrote it in 1970.
Wow.
But he was a brilliant cultural critic. But one of the things that it's very, very dangerous to talk about a book before you finished it. But one of the things that I find really interesting in this book is he talks about, obviously, as you saw in the title, the folklore of white supremacy. But he says what the flip side of that is the fake lore of Black, I'm trying to think of what the word he used, but the fake lore of sort of Black underachievement or underperformance. And it seems to me that we spend a lot of time talking about white supremacy and the folklore of white supremacy and those things. But I think sometimes in education, we don't spend enough time talking about that fake lore of Black underperformance, which is like, actually, and I was blessed when I taught when I started, I taught in a 100% African-American school. That's actually the only school that I've ever taught in my life. And I saw the incredible capability of my students and the wonderful young people they were. And I'm very blessed that I taught a while ago, and they're now all young adults, and they're married and they have kids, and we're Facebook friends, and they're thriving. And it's just it's the best thing one of the best parts of my life is watching them grow up and thrive. But I think that idea that so many of the stereotypes are fake, they're not real, that the infinite capacity that our young people have, I think is so important. And no one realizes that more than a child's parents, right?
I think this is really important, Mike.
Right?
This is one of the reasons why I think this is why I think it's really important to make this point, though, and drive it home, though. When we talk about new forms of schooling or new ways of getting an education, hybrid homeschooling or pods, the very first thing that the conversation does is rush to the people who will never be able to. The poor and people of color are going to be, X'd out of that. And there's kind of this default setting of the deficiency and the inability of Black and brown people, not a rush to judgment in the positive of, boy, won't it be interesting to see what the Black community could do with that idea. And that says so much, I think, about the ingrained anti-Blackness in the United States, that you equate Blackness with the inability to do. So anytime a new project comes up, or a new kind of school, or a new kind, I guess that just leaves people of color out, because you're going to need to have some agency to be able to do that, as if we didn't damn near invent agency and build half the country. So I love that you call this out in the book. Also, not just communities of color, but the under-identified students that have promise could find real, kids of color, I should say, and Black kids could find real promise in this. But what about this urban Christian? Now, I've heard of so there's a group that does lots of information and study of Christians, and does a lot of what are they, Barnum or Barna group. They do a lot of study of what the next wave of Christians are going to do. And you have more Christians now who don't want to be called Christian. They want to be called spiritual, or, these different things. But I've never seen anybody call it out in terms versus geography, like urban Christians. I think in your book, you talk a little bit about they may be, younger parents who are Christian, who live in urban communities that are a little bit hostile to the values that they have, and a full-time a full-time Christian education might be financially out of their reach. Do I have it right? Is that the way you
Yeah, I
break
mean,
down that group?
yeah, I kind of look at a couple trends. So one is this trend that we see of cities kind of vacuuming up opportunity. That if you more and more big cities, whether it's the Twin Cities up slightly north of where I am now, or here in Kansas City, but even some of these mega cities, New York, San Francisco, Austin, Nashville, we see them hoovering up jobs and opportunity in all of those places. And it turns out that if you want, more upward mobility, more jobs, one of the best things you can do is try and move to one of these superstar cities. Well, at the same time that trend is happening, where more and more opportunity is locating in cities, what we see in a lot of trends is that they tend to be much more secular places. And in some cases, depending on your survey, they tend to be more sort of hostile to traditional religious values. And so, some of the schools that I profile in this are these little kind of groups of Christians that, they don't see in the public schools. They see some hostility to their values. But as you're right, to send their kids to a full-time Christian school is insanely expensive. And so they're trying to find some way, how can we have our little community? A lot of them are based around a church, but with their school as well, in a way that is affordable, so we can still live in these cities where all the opportunity is, but we still have the opportunity to maintain our faith and our values and pass that on to our kids. And I just think that that's, as other folks who've read my work know, like, I'm a pretty deeply committed pluralist, and I believe in the sort of rich tapestry that is America, and that all of these folks, whether you're religious or whether you're not religious, or various religious denominations, make America a more brilliant place, right? Like, it's great to see all of these folks of, oh, someone just put it on here. Yes, the folklore of white supremacy and folklore of Black pathology. That was the word I couldn't remember. Thank you so much there, Michelle. That's awesome. But anyway, yeah, so I could see where they kind of feel like fish out of water in those places. So this is one way where they could solve that, where they could still have this opportunity to pass on their values to their children, but in a way that they can afford it.
And I think that's interesting in that you still have to pick a school to be your partner in in hybrid homeschooling. So, the market would need to develop for these people more options of schools that actually serve their kind of spiritual needs a little bit.
For sure.
And it seems like no matter what, with an idea like this, it starts out small, and it's a nascent kind of situation. And then over time, there's a market response because more people are doing it. There might be more schools that start to develop the muscles of doing it. Like, we've got more parents doing it. Yeah, let's figure out how we can, make this great. So another one of the groups that you were looking at was it families that need to take a break, or students that need to take a break?
Yeah.
So tell me more about these students that need to take a break from traditional schooling, the traditional model, and what they might appreciate about hybrid homeschooling.
Yeah, I think one of the most troubling trends that we see in American society right now is increases in diagnoses of things like anxiety, depression, unfortunate statistics about increases in young people committing suicide or attempting suicide, being hospitalized for attempting suicide. Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, has a lot of writing about this. And, it's not entirely clear why that is happening. Some people blame, social media, or I don't know. I don't know why it's happening. I just know that it is happening. And again, when we're seeing it in statistics like kids being hospitalized or others, it's not just self-reports. So I had a lot of reason to believe that this is a real thing that's happening. And one of the things that I found in these schools, which was really interesting, and part of this is for students with those mental health needs, but I also found it in talking to a lot of parents of children with other special needs. So children with sensory processing disorders, children on the autism spectrum. I remember talking to this mom whose child, I think, had a sensory processing disorder. So he became overwhelmed very easily and could just kind of spiral out of control quickly. Is the long and the short of what could happen if he just got overwhelmed. And she said, you can't believe how powerful it is for me to be able to say, you don't have to go to school tomorrow. Right? So their school went like Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And again, from my teaching days, I remember those kids who showed up on Monday, and sometimes they showed up on Monday because they'd had a terrible weekend, and so they started off on the wrong foot, and it went downhill from there. And there were other kids who showed up awesome on Monday, but just like something happened, right? Like they got in an argument with a friend of theirs, and then that caused them to be upset in class, and then like Monday's a bad day, and then Tuesday it gets worse, and they argue with the teacher, and they're suspended on Wednesday, right? Like this thing goes downhill, as opposed to in many of these schools, kids go to school on Monday. If they have a bad day, they're at home on Tuesday. They're in a nurturing environment. They can decompress. They can process what happened. They can, whatever that bad thing was, they're with their parents. They can work through it, and they have the time and the space to do it. So it's not like in a traditional school day where you have lots of kids. They get up too early. They slam down breakfast. They're like asleep in class in the morning. You get this sweet spot, right, from like 9:30 to 11 where everything's cooking. And then they eat a garbage lunch. They're in a sugar coma in the afternoon, right? And then you maybe, as they emerge from the sugar coma, you got a good hour, but like this day's almost done and they're looking at the exit, right? Then they have after school activities, they're playing sports, they're doing whatever. They come home, they slam down dinner, they have to do homework. And before you know it, like they're asleep. And if any of these kind of negative cycles start happening, there just isn't like the space for them to get out of them. And they don't get to spend that quality time with their family. Well, contrast that to like a hybrid homeschooling model where on Monday, all of that stuff happens. And maybe they do get up early and maybe they are in the sugar coma and whatever. But sort of like after extracurriculars or dinner or whatever, they're done, right? They get to hang out with their family. They get to spend quality time. And then they wake up Tuesday morning and all of that homework that was basically like worthless the night before because they're exhausted and they're not learning anything and they're just like kind of farting their way through it because they have to get it done. Oh man, they wake up in the morning and they're ready to rock. And so, you talk to teachers, they're like, I can assign like 2 or 3 times the amount of homework because they're doing it at 8 in the morning when they're ready to go. And kids, I talked with students that were involved in this and they're like, yeah, I like to get up early. I like to get up a little bit later, but it's sort of like they're in more control of that and they're just humming with the work that they're doing. So I think all of that stuff is just, there were so many families I talked to that talked about just the mental health of their kids, that it was so much better to be able to A, get them to do the work when their brains are working the best, B, to fit with a schedule that more meets their kind of circadian rhythms. It's a schedule that better fits family life so they can, again, have that support. So yeah, I mean, I think the mental health bit is something that oftentimes in education we don't talk about. Like a lot of times when I talk about this book, like the number of things like, what are the reading and math test scores we're doing? I'm like, I get that, and that's important. But it's also like, what about all of this other stuff that we need for kids to help develop? Yeah, man.
Yeah, you mentioned Haight's work. John Haight has a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. I've seen him talk in person about this. It scares the hell out of me. He talks a little bit about if you look at the trend line for girls, especially who are having major depressive episodes, from 2005 to 2010-ish, 10, 11, you notice kind of like pretty much a straight line, a flat line, little bit, a tiny little peak in 2007, followed by a decline and a leveling off. But then right about here in 2010, right when some of the major platforms, social media platforms, are taking off, you start seeing girls wildly swing upward in the number of depressive episodes that they have. Boys, boys are always slower on the trend lines of a lot of things. But the mean girl syndrome, to me, in this chart, the thing that it points me out for, and having a daughter, this scares the hell out of me. It points to a different factor of socialization. When people talk about homeschooling, oftentimes the first thing they say is, well, how are your kids going to be socialized? By living at home, and studies of straight up homeschooling have just dispelled so many of the myths about it, but people still hold those myths. And the really weird, backward American attitude is you go to school to become socialized in the positive, when really school is like a jungle. It's like the Lord of the Flies for a lot of kids. It's like
For sure.
it's like all hell breaks loose, mean girl syndrome, cyberbullying, straight up physical in-person bullying. We have these mega schools. I don't know if this fits into your research at all, but years ago, the EPA actually put out something called Smart Growth Schools, and it was talking about the size of schools having a problem, becoming a problem. And it was basically saying that for a lot of kids, actually small schools are superior. Like it doesn't even matter what kind, just the size of a school, right?
For sure.
And it seems like the hybrid homeschooling model might, number one, give the parents more control over the socialization of their children, two, stay more in touch with them so that if they saw one of these trends, like you're becoming depressed or whatnot, you would know faster. And lastly, you might be able to choose smaller schools when you do engage for those 2 days or 3 days of the week. You might be able to control it a little more. These kind of massive, this culture of like the 1600 school, person school is ridiculous. It's weird.
Yeah. Oh my God, the ability to just get lost in that shuffle. And I don't doubt that there are some kids at that stage in their life who want to get lost in the shuffle, right? Like that's like where they want to be. But I would say for the vast majority of kids, they want to be known. They want to be understood. They want to be all those things. And that's just tough. Like, I mean, I think there are even schools that are bigger. I mean, you have schools with a couple thousand kids in them. And the thought that like an administrator or someone is going to know who you are, like, do they even know that you go to school there? And so you're right. So many of these things like pop up in kids' lives and they're subtle, right? And so, if you're a teacher that has a great relationship with a kid, you can see that, well, that's different. Like they're not like that, or they always do their homework and they didn't yesterday. And you have that opportunity to kind of pull them aside and say, hey, is everything okay? Like what's going on? But again, like it's very easy to get lost in that shuffle. So you're right. I think this also gives the opportunity. And part of this is just like the cost thing. Because these schools are less expensive to operate because they only operate a couple days a week, and you can do a lot of stuff with facilities and others where you kind of like can rotate your, you can have your K through 4 on some days and your 5 through 8 on the other days. You can be more efficient and that sort of stuff. You can operate these things as smaller schools, which I think I'm a big believer in smaller schools. Like I think it's good to know kids. We want to keep an eye on them, like in the positive sense, like, hey, I know you. I saw you do that thing right? I saw you score that touchdown on the playground. I heard from Mrs. Whatever that you got an A on your quiz. Like that's the stuff that kids need to build that kind of positive momentum to keep going.
Well, and I love the fact that it takes the steam off of both parties. Like the schools, it feels like it takes some of the weight off of the school to have a parent that's taking up half of the load there. Like, sharing the responsibility. I think if I've learned anything about, I've learned lots of things during COVID over the last year. If I've learned anything that sticks out to me as an aha for me personally, it's the extent to which prior to COVID, parents really believed that education of their children was 100% the responsibility of the schools, and they hadn't even exercised. They had been infantilized over years. Over years, parents have been infantilized and professionalized out of the educational equation. So when they suddenly had to be in control of it, it was like, oh my God, I am supposed to be educating these. Wait, I got to do what? They started having to have cognition around what, when, where, and how of education. And I think that might have grew a new set of muscles for some parents. Like now they're used to it. Yeah.
This is
that's new.
One of these things
I just want to say that's new.
Oh yeah. Well, I was just gonna say one of these things that frustrated me forever is exactly what you're talking about. If we look at the course of the last 70 or 80 years of public schooling, in many good ways, the professionalization, all of those things were good. I don't want to say that they were bad. They were good. But a narrative started to develop from, I think, the side of educators that said, put your kids on the bus, send them to us, and we'll take it from there. And I don't know if you follow some of these people on like Instagram or others that are like teacher complaint pages. And it seems like a lot of them are like, what are these parents doing questioning me? Like, I'm the professional. I've been trained to
Right.
do this. Parents don't know what they're doing, whatever. But then the irony of all ironies is that so that's been the message for like 2 or 3 generations now. We're professionals. We've been trained to do this. You give your kids to us and like we'll handle it. And then parents complain like, oh, or schools complain, oh, these parents like are totally disconnected and they're like not involved. They don't. It's like, because that's what you told them to do. Like
It's
you
kind of like you
told
think.
families to not be connected to this, and then you're shocked when they're not connected. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that these schools really do invert that and say, no, parents, you are incredibly important and you are going to play a role in this. And I think that that leads to good things. I think it's good for parents. I think it's good for kids. I actually think it's good for teachers too. It takes some like relationship management, and some of the teachers that I talked to in this who had come from traditional schools were like, yeah, this is different. I spend a lot more time talking to parents. We get like have each other's cell phone numbers and we work together. But once that sort of starts to click, it's like, whoa, we're on the same team. Like the parents and the teachers are working together. They're reinforcing each other, right? Like, yes, your mother was exactly right. And I'm gonna, right? And it's like all of that stuff working together. And again, these kids are just enmeshed. I think of it like a cocoon or whatever, where all of the adults in their lives agree with one another. They're working together. And it's just such a nurturing environment for kids to grow up in.
You know, I can't get past this point without sharing this book. It's one that I go back to oftentimes. I have both a Kindle copy and a hard copy. It's William Cutler's Parents and Schools. This book actually is a 150-year survey of what happened over time to remove the power from the parents to the schools, how it transferred over time, and how parents eventually were professionalized out of the equation. So if anybody's ever looking for just kind of like a how did that happen type of book, like, you know, it used to be that education was the full responsibility of the parent and of the family. And somehow over time, administrators and pedagogues and teachers and trainers and bureaucrats over time really kind of muscled their way, you know, in and made it their thing. Like, this is our domain. And suddenly your child was just like a byproduct of their domain, whereas previously it had been that education was for children. It was like, and you owned the child because you were the parent. So I can't get by without bringing that into the discussion. So if anybody wants to, if you missed that part of it, just shoot me an email. I'll let you know what this book is. But I'm interested now in this last group of people that you talked about, which were the middle income pedagogue. I don't know which one it would be.
I don't even know if it's a real word, but yeah.
Yeah. So tell me, it is a real word, definitely, because I actually I've added a word to it, a compound word. I talk about paleo pedagogues.
There you go.
And those are the people who are into the old school teaching. But
sure.
So tell me about the middle income pedagogue as one of the groups that you identify that this is good for, that hybrid learning is good for.
Yeah. So one of the very first schools that I was like connected with to study this called the Augustine Academy. It's in Delafield, Wisconsin, which is kind of between Milwaukee and Madison. And someone that I had worked with before at AEI had moved to Wisconsin and started this. And so they were a great window into this whole world. But it's an Ambleside school. And I'd never actually heard of Ambleside before, but the Ambleside method, for those who like me had never heard of this before, it's kind of like classical education, but there was like 100 years ago, there was a British kind of education thinker by the name of Charlotte Mason, and she was a big believer in like the great books. And the idea is that sort of the text, they talk about it as a triangle, where the text is really the teacher, and the teacher and the student kind of work together to learn from the text. This is the long and the short of it. And there's sort of other stuff that's mixed into it. So it's kind of classical adjacent. And it just turns out that some of these families, one of the families that started, had seen these schools somewhere else and just loved it. Like, thought this was like the coolest thing ever. We think it's awesome for our kids. The exact type of environment. They do a lot of stuff outside. I mean, it's a cool school model. Well, what they realized was A, where they moved, there was no Ambleside school, and B, almost every Ambleside school in America is like north of 20 grand a year per kid to go there. They're very, very expensive, kind of hoity-toity private schools. And this is the same thing that I saw talking to people who are involved in like Waldorf schooling, Montessori schooling, all of these sort of more progressive models, as well as sort of more traditionalists, like classical education or some of your paleo pedagogue folks. Like all of these folks are interested in those, but they tend to be expensive private schools. There are some examples of charter schools that have gotten into this, so like the Great Hearts are kind of a classical education charter school. There are actually some of these schools in like Colorado, there are Waldorf schools and others, but those are sort of exceptions to the rule. The general rule is that these are expensive private schools. So these families got together and said, like, look, we want to make this school happen, but we don't have the money to pay for that. And so they said, look, what if we do this kind of hybrid model? We can dramatically drive down the cost where it's affordable to all these folks. And so I think that this kind of middle income group, unfortunately, doesn't have nearly as much sort of, they don't have the opportunities that wealthier people have. So some of them might be able to move for better schools, but they don't always have the money to attend private schools. And then oftentimes they don't necessarily live in areas with charter schools, or they don't qualify for voucher programs or others. So they're kind of that donut hole, right? Where they're too wealthy for programs that assist the poor, but they're too poor to really take all the benefits of sort of wealthier things in education. So this is an opportunity for them where really what they need is just lower cost private schooling. And this is a way for them to do it.
I think that's really interesting because globally speaking, in Africa and other places, low-cost private schools is a thing, like figuring out how to deliver them. And it's interesting. It's American edupreneurs, education entrepreneurs who are figuring out how you deliver, high quality, low cost private schools, but in other countries, not here in the United States. So this feels like a way to make it happen. Do you have any thoughts or ideas in your research about like how to work with districts to carve out space for this, for the parents in their districts that would be interested? What's the arrangement? Or did you see any good arrangements with traditional school districts that you thought were interesting?
Yeah, so like that school district in Kentucky, I thought was really cool, where basically it's kind of a rural area in kind of outside of Lexington, Kentucky, and it took a great leader to look at his community and say, look, we have a lot of homeschoolers in this community, but like we're all on the same team here, right? It's not us and it's not them. And sort of I think of it sort of like we're team knowledge and we're all fighting against ignorance, right? Like we're on the same side here. So what he did was he got all the local homeschoolers together and he invited them into the school library and he said, how can we help you? How can we work together? What problems do you have that we can help solve, right? We're not trying to snuff you out and we're not trying to like recruit you. We're not trying to get all of you to come to school here full time. What problems do you have that we can solve? And I think that it takes that type of leadership that says we're on the same team and that we actually, as public schools, have resources and abilities that can help solve people's problems. Like we have something to offer. We shouldn't be afraid. We should be vocal about this. We can help you. Let's find a way to work together. Now, so that's the kind of practice side, right? If there's policy and practice, that's the practice that needs to take place. The policy side is, the money's got to follow the kids, right? So a lot of these school districts are not going to say, hey, we're going to stand up this new program pro bono, right? Or we're not going to even we're going to charge tuition to you or whatever, right? So we've got to create some more flexible funding that says, look, we will fund you for a third of a kid if the kid comes for a third of the day. We'll fund you for halftime. We'll fund you for three-quarter time. Like, that's fine. Like, and then obviously there's regulatory stuff. Are they classified as homeschoolers? Are they classified? But that's stuff that can be worked out. But so there is a policy piece that the money's got to follow the kids. But there is that practice piece as well, that schools have to look at homeschoolers and say, you're not weirdos. You're not our enemies. You're not like actively trying to harm your kids. All the terrible stereotypes of of homeschoolers. Like, they need to not see it that way, and be more open to this happening. So it takes both of those sides, though, for it to work. And it's tough because there are some places where one side exists and some places where the other side exists, but you need to have the opportunity for both of those. But there's actually one other example of that I sort of forgot about until just now, but I thought it's an interesting one. I profiled some of these schools that are in California that actually started as like dropout recovery programs. So California's had a long tradition of this, and back in the day, they were like correspondence courses, right? So you've been kicked out or you failed classes, and so you like check in with a teacher once a week or whatever. And again, some bright traditional public school educators, this was traditional public sector, said, yeah, this is not working, right? Like, these kids are not like. The kid who's been kicked out of school, checking in once a week with like a packet of paper, like, that's not going to work. So what they said was, let's start a school where they come in one day a week. And frankly, a lot of them started with elective programs and said, look, you have to take one core subject. I think some of them started with math. And they're like, look, math is where everybody's getting killed. So you got to take math. But for this one day, why don't you come in and you'll take math? But then the rest of the day, you'll take elective classes, you'll take art and music and all of this like fun stuff to keep you engaged in learning. And then for some of these kids, that got them back into a traditional model. Some of them, they wanted to start coming more than one day a week. But again, it's starting with like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What are the unique assets that we bring to the table? And how can we work together under the framework of public policy that lets us kind of try some of these different and innovative things?
I think so I'm sold on the idea. Somebody who has kids upstairs right now, I'm not real. What I've learned in the last year is how we should have been homeschoolers all along. But there are definitely things that would make it more attractive if we were doing the hybrid model, where we were taking up part of the load and the school district was taking up part of the load. Right now, we're doing 100% remote learning. It's not, my kids just have basically said, it's got to be one or the other. Like, remote has been terrible. They're not learning anything. So they'd rather go back to school, or they rather go full-time homeschooling, but they're not enjoying this remote learning thing because basically it's just the worst of teaching online is what it's turned out to be. Yeah, it's just been the worst of everything online. But a hybrid model where they could go in, see their friends, they could participate in some stuff, and for the rest of the week, they could also be able to sleep in, be able to regulate how they eat and when they eat and all that stuff, I think would be super attractive. But what I would need is like this, I would need like a toolkit that drops in the mail that says, so, maybe a big headline. So you want to start hybrid schooling in your state, and open the box. And this is how to talk to your local representative and state senator about it. I have a state representative who's she taps into me from time to time with education stuff. She would be happy to start clearing some of the brush in the state if there was anything I could give her that was specific. Like, this is what we need to be able to set up the enablers, the policy enablers that make it possible. And then our superintendent, I'm sure he would be a guy who would have the conversation you said, like the one where he brings in all the homeschoolers and talks to people. We're kind of in a, semi-rural area. So, he holds a lot of sway. He would be able to bring people in and sit down, have a conversation. So you might have hooked me on this idea. I might be taking this to the school district and try it out. Maybe we have a show, a year from now where I get to say, okay, I went and tried your thing. And this is what we came out with.
Well, can I tell you a very short, crazy story? But one of the focus groups that I did for this, interviewing groups of parents, and I can't thank hybrid homeschoolers enough. That like when the pandemic hit, like I was supposed to visit more schools, and they were so kind and so generous with their time. I cannot possibly thank them enough. But one of the craziest things that happened, I didn't put it in the book because it would come off as self-serving, and it may come off as self-serving right now. But so I'm having this focus group. Where did you find out about this? How did you learn about it? And someone's like, oh, I've heard about it from church, or my cousin does it, or whatever. And one person in the focus group says, yeah, I read that article that you wrote about them.
Oh, wow.
I was like, whoa. And so of course I'd ask, I was like, please tell me you're happy, like that I didn't ruin your life.
Yeah.
You read this article, it sounded like a good idea, and it's terrible, and that's all my fault, and I apologize. but he was super happy. So I was glad. I was like, well,
That's amazing. That's full circle. That's it
at
coming
least
full
one.
circle.
I've
Yeah.
done. I can look back and say maybe at least one person has a better education for their kids because of what I did. But no, but I think you're right, and I do think there's a space here for philanthropy. And I think there's so much more interest now than there was before. I think it was a harder sell earlier because it was saying, philanthropy loves scale, right? They love like, well, how can we have 5 million of these things? And unfortunately, the way hybrid homeschooling works, it's much more decentralized, it's much more homegrown. And so it's like not necessarily a comfortable space for philanthropy, but creating exactly the stuff that you're talking about, which is all of the ancillary stuff, both on the school side and on the family side. So like on the school side, how do you set these things up? How do you work within the correct regulatory stuff to know whether you need to classify as a private school if you're like an enrichment program or something, depending on your state laws? What are your state homeschooling laws? What are your state private school regulations? Like all of that would be great. And you're right on the family side as well, which is like, how can you find out about these groups? I put there's an appendix in the book that gives some resources. I think it's actually titled, So You Want a Hybrid Homeschool? And it has some resources that are there, but you'll see it's a very short appendix because there aren't that many resources available right now. So I think this is a great role that philanthropy could play to try and build up exactly what you're talking about, these enablers, the people who can make this happen, the structures, I want to start this school. Here's a packet. Here's what like your handbook can look like. And here's what all of this sort of stuff ready to rock.
And I see in the appendix, so you want to hybrid homeschool. So it's just in there, just in the way that I said. One of the things that we didn't get around to talking about, and I hope you will come back again so that we can keep talking. One of the things that I think we didn't get to that is super important to me is the use of time. How important it is to make good use of time. That came up in yesterday's conversation that I had about the achievement gospels. So in Karen Chenoweth's book, I think she touches on the use of time. In all the great school leaders I've ever talked about, they talk about how we're wasting so much time of kids' time and learning. And you kind of, I think, blew it open for me. It's like much of the time that kids are spending in school, period, is actually not productive time. And my kids, like I say, they're at home. We have more control over the time now of like how and what and when of what they're doing. And I kind of like it. Go ahead.
The message that sends to kids, right? When you and teachers, when you don't take kids when you take them seriously. Like when you're a teacher and you listen to what they have to say, the quality of what they have to say goes up. Right? When they say, whoa, someone's really listening to me. Someone is taking me seriously. Kids act more seriously, right? And so, and teachers, I think, is the same way. When you treat teachers seriously, they act seriously. But when you waste their time and there's all sorts of administrivia or whatever it is that gets in the way of doing it, you send these subtle messages to kids and teachers that school is not a serious place, that, we're not really doing anything important here because we're going to interrupt it 14 times. And that subtle message that you send to kids, like they internalize it. And so taking kids' time seriously, and yes, I'm happy to come back. I'm talk about anything under the sun, you know me. Just put me in front of a mic and I'll start going. But I really
I'm happy about it. I think you should start a movement around this. I mean, I know that it's a book and you probably have 8 more books, in you. But I think this particular one should be somewhat of a more than a book. It should be a movement. And I think people should start connecting with each other around the idea and build community around the idea. And these different people that you profiled in the book, I think, should know each other and be connected across state lines so that people like me, who I'm in a state where I'm in a state and a place within my state where this could be an option for a unheard group of parents right now. They're floating around. They're the unheards. They're the great unheard, and maybe we can turn them into a herd. And I think, for people listening and watching, the thing about these ideas to me, Mike mentioned scale. And I think one thing that public education does really well is it scales failure quickly. So failure is the number one thing that scales easily in public education is failure.
They got that
competence. Yeah. They got that on lock. That's their monopoly. They have a monopoly on scaling failure. And I've called, public education hospice for good ideas, because oftentimes it's not that it's bad people or a bad system necessarily. It's that when you have an idea like this that we're talking about today, and then someone asks the question, but how do you scale that? That is the devil question, because once you do that, everything bad happens after that, to me, in my opinion. I really believe in start small, not start big. I really believe in grow slow, not grow fast, right? Like some of the best things in the world grow slowly, not like, let's go to scale. Sure. Yeah. So 1 million pilots of this, small pilots, would be like preferable to somebody taking the idea and making it some national, like, you know, we're going to do a whole bunch of small schools. No, you're not. No, you're not. What you're going to do is, you know, Mike, when I hear something like that, the first thing I think in my mind is I can already write the research paper on this that's going to come out 10 years from now. Like what a waste that was, right? I can see it. I can forecast in the future, but small people in small groups doing small things slowly and in controlled environments can actually be better than some big national projects. So anyways, that's my soapbox for the week. Mike, I actually do want you to come back again. I'd love to keep talking about this issue. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, man. For everybody listening and watching, this has been an hour with Mike McShane. He's from EdChoice. You can find them at edchoice.org. They have I can't say enough about them in terms of the information that they have. I believe that activism has to be informed. So, and I think people who put out information oftentimes don't understand how to make it actionable. So me at Brightbeam, in my work, I'm into infovism, which is information and activism put together. Get the geeks and the geek squad, the street squad, together. The geeks in the streets. Get the geeks in the streets together. Yeah. So we can win everything if we can get the geeks in the streets together. Mike is one of my favorite people in this field because he doesn't throw around his credentials. He just does the work and puts it out there, which I think is amazing. When your work is your brand, as I said to him earlier, when your work is your brand, you can be trusted more. We have lots of flashy people out here in the world who get a doctorate and they want to like start branding themselves and they have nothing behind them, no scholarship. And then they become Twitter heroes and, you know, they become a trusted voice for no other reason except for they're part of the Twitterati and not because they put out actual product. Mike has multiple books, multiple research studies. He's a great resource. So if you're listening or watching to this and thinking I need a speaker or I need somebody to kind of help me break down some of my research on school choice or what parents are doing, tap into Mike. Find him. Great guy. Mike, I appreciate you, man. We're going to have you back on again.
It was incredible.
Oh, hold up your book one last time too, so everybody can see the book. So everybody, this is the book.
A Guide to the Future of Education.
And I got mine because I practice sustainable reading. I got a Kindle copy yesterday, actually. So I'm reading the book. When I'm done with it, I'll have you back on.